Hello. Let me turn it on. Can you hear? Yep. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out today. This is really, really exciting. This is my first time being in an event with this many people in the room. So congratulations to you, Jessica. I think that's really exciting. Okay, so to introduce myself real quick, my name is Vicki Lon. I am the podcast host for Speculative Sandbox. You can find me anywhere if you Google. I interview authors and we talk about tropes. So I was very honored when Crispin asked me to host this, and I got a chance to read her book. And as you can see, I annotated it because there's so many interesting things. So first of all, let's give a warm welcome to Jessica Emerson. We'll put it together once more. I'll read her bio. So Jessica is an award-winning author. Her stories and poems have been published in journals, including Airlight Magazine, the Beloit Fiction, I went French a little bit there. The Beloit Fiction Journal, Midwestern Gothic, Crucible, Drash, and Anemone Sidecar. Her original play, The Greys, was produced in Hollywood. She earned her MFA in creative writing from Antioch University, Los Angeles, and her BA in journalism from USC. Jessica lives with her husband and children in the Sonoran Desert. Ask her about pie, Rancho Gordo beans, 1970s singer-songwriters, her challah bread technique, or the recipe for a perfect old-fashioned. Put it together again for Jessica.
That's true.
All right, so next on our itinerary is a reading from Olive Days, but first I should ask, who here is familiar with the premise of this book?
Okay, a few people.
All right, a few people. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to read the synopsis, and then she'll go into the reading. Okay. Rena Kirsch is an exhausted young mother and modern Orthodox Jew in the Pico Robertson neighborhood of Los Angeles. Dutifully keeping to the formidable expectations of a traditional household connects Rena with generations past and those to come. But the contradiction burns at her center. Rena is an atheist. She is also stymied in her life and marriage. Hoping to reinvigorate their relationship, Rena's husband convinces her to partake in a night of wife swapping with other Orthodox couples. Rather than preserve her marriage, however, the swap plunges Rena down a heady path that begins with a rekindled passion for painting and culminates in an intoxicating affair with Will, her married Mexican-American art teacher. Clandestine rendezvous and stolen moments of ardor awaken Rena to an existence beyond the confining parameters of tradition, offering a glimpse at the possible life she left behind in the olive groves of her youth. As the blush of erotic thrill comes into sharp contrast with the complications of living a secret life, Rena must decide if it's worth sacrificing everything she's ever known to fully inhabit the uncharted landscape unfolding before her, one where her needs take precedence. All right, take it away, Jessica.
Great. On? You can hear me? Okay. So, thank you. I'm going to say, first of all, that I've been at many readings of even dear friends where I hate the reading portion. So if you're that person, rip. It won't be longer than 7 minutes, and then we can get into questions. But if you're a person who likes to hear an author read a little, here we go. This section happens after the wife swap. And my father was a little nervous when he was like, "What are you going to read? I think you can only read the acknowledgments out loud." And I said, "No, I assure you there are whole sections I can read." And for those who don't know, Shabbos is the Yiddish word for Sabbath, and you're going to hear it a lot. The 18th Shabbos. Like every Friday, she woke well before the family to do the dusting and wash the hard floors. Yoni always woke by 5, a leftover habit from nursing until he was nearly 3. Shosh liked to sleep later, but on Fridays, Rena woke her at 6, and together they made the challah dough. She sat Yoni on the counter, held him with one hand, and let him crack an egg and smash the yolk in his little hand, which she then promptly washed and sanitized. Rena loved to watch them together like that, Shosh on a step stool and Yoni wobbling on the counter. Shosh broke the eggs one at a time into a small bowl used only for that purpose, checked for any spots of blood, then slid each clean egg into the large wooden mixing bowl, the only treasure Rena had claimed when her grandmother died. She handed them each a piece of dough. Yoni squished and poked his, but Shosh, not yet 5, slapped it down expertly and started folding it over itself. Preschool ended early on Fridays for Shabbos, and Rena always waited to braid and bake the chalot until Shosh got home. Weeks that she made large batches for company, most weeks, she let Shosh take the small piece of dough for the burnt offering and place it carefully in the back of the toaster oven to smolder. While the loaves baked, she let them mash old bananas to make quick bread for Shabbos breakfast, let them eat more chocolate chips than they stirred into the batter, mopped the floor again after Shosh sprayed the pans with nonstick spray and inevitably missed. These were her favorite moments of Shabbos, her only true moments of peace, the moments before Shabbos even started, and she had her children and their smiles all to herself. The rest was shrill and strenuous. From the frenzy to be ready in the moments before sunset, David rushing home and foul, the children bathed and dressed, being ready for company to arrive or ready to walk to someone's house, leaving time for the men to daven at shul, being sure the food was done and tomorrow's lunch put up to warm overnight, carefully choosing which soda bottles to open so that you didn't break a commandment by twisting off a top that had been stamped in such a way that opening it would break letters apart in an act that could, who knew, be like writing, thus forbidden on Shabbos. To the spilled juice, piles of dishes, and crumbs in every corner of the house that she just spent the day emptying, so it could be filled again with the detritus of a day of rest. The sweeter Shabboses of her childhood had been a pretense, all intense fondness from her parents during the blessing of the children, the best food of the week, games, books, napping next to her grandfather on the old couch in the den. Oh, the unscheduled hours, while the adults were at prayer, when her unfettered mind could burst free and full of electric colors and unnameable cracklings, like when she would press down hard on her eyelids, let them go, and then watch her nerves firing like it was a show. When they were guests in other homes, it was a wild freedom, reckless almost, to explore foreign rooms and foreign yards, marveling at the bookshelves and toys of others, pirating through the citrus trees that lined the tiny backyards, hiding behind pleated paper window coverings with a crayon, and daring herself to break Shabbos by making a mark. At sleepaway camp, her friends thought Shabbos afternoon was boring. They played cards and ate cold cuts and complained, but Rena exulted in the unstructured hours, often spent in the orchard. A counselor had shown her both how to reach up through the bird netting to pluck the ripe apricots that had already detached, and how to smash the downy green husks of the fallen almonds so that the drupes could be peeled out whole. You couldn't pick fruit on Shabbos, but the orchard offered its gifts to her just the same. Mostly, she gathered olives. There were only 2 olive trees, but they were old and fruited madly in the early summer, and the campers were all taught how to cure olives as part of a Torah study on purity. On Shabbos afternoons, alone in the grove, she would gather the fallen ones, rolling them onto a flat path between tree furrows, and then lay on top of them in her Shabbos whites. She napped on the yielding olives and hot earth with mulch in her hair, the small brown ants and garden spiders crawling over her apricot sticky hands, waking to drowsily consider the light filtering through the trees, the ripeness. She rolled around a bit before she stood, the olives like beads off her shirt, the olives like beads in a massage chair, and then went back to her tent to strip off her shirt and examine the patterns of their purple juice. She always wanted her mother to ask how it happened, those landscapes of stains, but her mother never did. They would head straight to the laundromat when she and her brother returned from camp. Her mother didn't want that much dirt in the machine at home, and her mother would cluck her tongue and say, well, they wouldn't fit next year anyway. Wash her Shabbos whites with the color load and fold them neatly. Later, they would be torn into rags. 6 summers, Rena created masterpieces on her Shabbos whites. In the later years, she was worried her mother would be able to perceive the lust in the striations, until their rag bag was only strips of purplish and white cotton. Her last summer in the orchard, the summer she thought her body might actually implode and shrivel to a pit if someone else didn't get inside it, she was so taken with her olive bed that she pressed a large round one into her mouth and bit through it, a lasting bitterness. I'm going to skip a little college scene, pick it back up. There were more olive days, that's all you need to know. Even in childhood, Shabbos had been lonely. At home, she trained in the kitchen alongside her mother, learning to shape gefilte fish loaves and braid bread and salt soup. Of course, her brother had no such training. All those hours in the orchard considering the sun, all those moments hiding behind the curtains at neighbors' homes and the tangerine trees in their yards, all those hours pretending to be asleep in the den and wishing someone would notice that she wasn't. Once, at a nearby home for Shabbos lunch, the children had been playing hide and seek and no one could find her. The adults got involved with the search, then her parents became worried, then they began searching homes and yards up and down the street. Shabbos was nearly out by the time the host found her because he heard Rena sobbing. She'd climbed up to the very top shelf in a utility closet and stayed up there 4 hours with her arms wrapped around her knees, dedicated to the premise of the game, and her sureness that if anyone really knew her, they'd know just where to look. If anyone really knew her, she'd deserve to be found. She supposed being busy and exhausted was better than being lonesome and bitter. This is what she told herself as she swept crumbs on her hands and knees on the 18th Shabbos after her husband had traded her. There was a thing people said, do the Jews keep Shabbos or does Shabbos keep the Jews? A foolish expression. It was she who kept Shabbos, kept it for all the Jews, kept it despite the bait and switch that happened once she was in charge of keeping it. The wives kept Shabbos, and the wives kept the Jews. The doughy, tradable wives, up to their elbows in cold gray sink basins. The waxed and stretch-marked wives. In this way, it was said, this way of keeping the Jews, women earned a holiness men could never possess. So instead, the men possessed the women themselves, kept them. Let them, like lumps, smolder into ash.
Thank you so much for sharing that passage, Jessica. Now, I will admit, the erotic scenes I love, but I also really love the care you put into writing about food. So can you tell me a little bit about the role food plays in your life?
Yeah. What role does food not play in my life would be a good question. I think there's a Jewish joke in there somewhere. But I cook a lot, right, guys? Yeah. I cook usually 6 nights a week. And I experience a lot of creative outlet through my cooking. And maybe we'll get into this a little bit more. But I actually think Rena does not experience, she's a creative person, but does not experience a big creative outlet through food. It's kind of rote. There's a passage where she says she doesn't even taste the food as she cooks. She cooks the same thing over and over again. So while you might read it and think like, whoa, she makes so many dishes, you know, across one holiday alone, she might make 30 dishes, and that might feel creative to you. To her, that's not really an outlet for creativity. But to me, making the menus in the book was extremely creative. And I actually sat and picked and choose favorite things that I make, but also favorite things that I've eaten in people's homes, and particularly in homes that are like the ones that Rena comes from. But I spend most of my days thinking about food. It's sort of a famous thing on Emerson family vacations. At breakfast, we mostly talk about what's for dinner. And so it would have been disingenuous for me to write a book that didn't have a lot of food.
You make a very elaborate menu every week.
All right, so we prepared some questions ahead of time, so I'm going to work my way through them. I'm going to kind of play this by ear because I know we're on a time crunch, and you guys probably might have questions too. So maybe, Crispin, you tell us when we should stop talking and open it up to the floor? Or someone will.
Or someone.
Okay, so a wife swap between couples sparks the event in the book. Rena is in charge of a lot of traditional values and upholding traditions within the home. She seems to carry a lot of the burden of doing that, as well as the guilt for having participated in this wife swap, even though it had been her husband's idea. Can you speak to the role guilt plays in your characters and their overarching themes?
Sure, I feel like there's another Jewish joke in that question. Because guilt, I think there's a trope about Jews and guilt, and particularly maybe how it manifests, kind of a very anti-feminist trope about, am I still on? Okay, how it manifests from mothers or mothers-in-law sometimes. I wasn't thinking a lot about that, but I was thinking about the way that guilt shows up in different characters' lives. And so, for instance, all right, let's tell a little bit more of the plot, and without any spoilers. I promise you'll get to it on like page 25. After the wife swap, she first has an affair with an ultra-Orthodox rabbi named Anshel, and later falls in love with somebody from outside the community. And Anshel is almost all guilt. That's his complete modus operandi. He's extremely religious, and that is how he experiences life, is through a filter of guilt, including guilt around this affair that he's having, even though he falls very deeply in love with Rena, with this character. Rena's husband, David, is all tied up in guilt, but he wields it. He doesn't really experience it. He uses it as sort of a cudgel in a number of ways. So his experience of guilt is that Will, who Rena ultimately falls in love with, I think experiences guilt in one of the most balanced ways in the book. He feels it, and he also has agency over his life and his own trajectory, and he's able to process it. but also he's self-medicating. Will's an alcoholic, so there are problems there, right? And Rena, it's so interesting because Rena, I just don't even think has the technology from her upbringing, from her life, to process at least this specific kind of guilt. She doesn't really have access to a technology to process guilt around adultery. Adultery isn't something that she considered, that she thought of throughout her life. And I think actually, and she thinks of the wife swap, by the way, as adultery. And again, that's not a spoiler. It's like page 1 through 10 kind of stuff, right? She thinks of it as adultery, and she says that to her husband when he proposes it. She says, this is adultery. And he says, well, is it, if everybody is consenting? And she's like, I think so. And so from that moment on, I think it's an important part of Rena's trajectory that because she doesn't really have a way of processing the guilt over this experience, she makes choices that I think probably many of us will read and say like, oh no, like, you know, what are you doing? But I actually think it's such a good question because I don't think she can process her guilt.
That is a really interesting answer. Thank you. And I see that you combined the answers to 2 questions. That's efficient. Good job.
What was your next question?
It was the role that those 3 men played in Rena's life. But you answered in the context of guilt. But do you want to expand on that? I mean,
I guess a little bit, which is that I think that her husband, David, was just there for her. It was an easy choice or no choice at all. Mm-hmm. And Anshul is a choice of convenience. Anshul is this rabbi at this center who she's been volunteering with for years, and that the exact moment that she's at her lowest, she happens to be in a room with him and just sort of collapses onto him. And listen, there were years of built up tension, but this is a thing of convenience. And Will represents a choice, perhaps also a choice from among offerings on the ground, right? He was in the room that she was in as well. But he's really a choice that she has to make. He's outside of the community. It's not at all like anything she's ever done. And so I think that you could also look at the men in her life as sort of a path over her own agency.
Mm-hmm. I definitely saw that as well as I was reading the book. Okay, so David is her husband.
Yes.
And Rena makes the following observation about David when they get married. Quote, she was reduced to the creature that she was bred to be, the creature she'd aspired to as a child. Her life was altogether linear. It would be 22 years of becoming, followed by maybe 70 years of being. Nothing ever happened that didn't fit into the template. Her life in no way resembled art. Can you explain this passage?
Oh no, that's why I wrote the book. Right? I don't know if you guys know this about book writing, but after you sell your book, they tell you like, now you have to write like 25 essays that we're gonna try to publish. And I'm like, I wrote a book, like that's what I wrote. And they're like, no, you also have to write these essays. So I had an essay come out today, which is great, but I'm still a little salty that I had to write it. So okay, yes, I can try to explain it. It's a really good question. I just don't want to answer. Look, she's a creative person. Rena's a creative person, and she has not been given very many creative outlets in her life. And to the extent that she has, this is a person who went to college. It's hard if you aren't. Some people in this room are familiar with sort of the spectrum of Jewish observance, and some people aren't. But modern Orthodox Jews, where she's from, are people who, especially the men, will be doctors and lawyers. It's different than a more, they don't like the term, but a more ultra-Orthodox Haredi experience, where really the jobs people are engaged in are mostly in the community, in teaching or in kosher law and things like that. So this community is people, so she went to college, and her parents maybe encouraged her in this thing. She loved art, which is what she studied. And her husband, even when they first get married, is like, hey, you know, like your art. But her life doesn't really allow for that. And so she was given one creative outlet, and she's like a deeply creative person. And so I think it leaves her in a really tough place. And one of the things that Will represents is, again, I think going back to the last answer, like a choice. And creativity, of course, doesn't only come out in painting. And I think for Rena, creativity and even artfulness come out a little bit in this obsessive love affair.
All right, so speaking of Will and the relationship, I observed their relationship got very interesting. It evolves over the book. And without giving away too much information, I have this question. Let's talk about loving someone and loving the idea of someone. In practice, is there a difference?
I think a lot of times there's a difference, but I also think when you think about early obsessive love affairs, like my husband and I had an obsessive love affair. Now we've been married for almost 11 years and it's wonderful. So I think that you could also talk about early obsessive love affairs in the Venn diagram, where at some point loving somebody and loving the idea of somebody are almost one circle, and then they grow further apart, and that could either be beneficial or it could be detrimental. And without also giving anything away, like there are some red flags in this relationship, right? So my husband, who's a very generous and patient man, before I ever knew him, one of the big paintings, I paint a little bit and I mostly paint to procrastinate writing, and one of the big pieces that I made on my wall is it's like a gorgeous piece of pop art, and it has a Dorothy Parker quote, "I loved them until they loved me." And my husband still lives with this every day on our walls, which is really lovely, and maybe a little offensive for him, but I think he likes the piece of art. So I think about that a lot, though, which is to say, I think about this idea of loving somebody until the exact moment when they love you, or loving the idea of somebody and then having it not mesh up. And I think that there are some really big flags between Will and Rena. But I also think that at the end, and I'll be curious, any of you can follow up with me after you finish the book to let me know what you think, that that their love affair, although this issue exists, that they maybe love the idea of each other, does move each of their identity. They're both on sort of a quest for identity, and it moves them forward on that path. And so in some ways, both of those things are generative, and I have no doubt that they love each other. I mean, I wrote it, I know they love each other, but maybe more than that, they love the idea of each other.
That's probably one of the best evolutions, reading that. That was great. All right, so I dug into the reviews on Olive Days, which is something I like to do when I'm preparing for an interview. And there was one that came out in the Jewish Journal Review where they observed, quote, "the lasting power of Jewishness in your book." How do you see your book reflecting that statement?
Whoa. She's lovely, the woman who wrote that review. Karen, I never met her before, but we were actually chatting just earlier today. I'd never heard of her before, and she wrote the review and then has turned into kind of an evangelizer for the book, and so we were chatting today. Okay, so first of all, I want to say, this is kind of like a problem when you put yourself out in the world with art, that I don't think I represent anybody. Just me and my characters that I wrote in the book. So I don't represent any part of Jewishness. I don't represent the Jewish people. I just want to be clear about that, and then I'm happy to talk about that question, because one thing people will notice is in this book, there's a lot of stuff about this Jewish life and this Jewish community that doesn't feel so nice, at least for Rena. And by the way, I think Rena is a special snowflake. That's why I wrote her. And that many other people are very happy in this community. It's not the community in her life. She's in a bad marriage, and it's hard for her to recognize. But there are a lot of things about the community that will feel oppressive, and I think that there's a lot of truth in what I've written for some people. But there's also a lot of beauty. And one of my concerns with the book is that the beauty that I've tried to portray in this community would be overshadowed by how oppressive it is for Rena. So I'm very interested in this idea of the lasting power of Jewishness. And I think actually those identity journeys that we were just talking about factor into, Rena has had one access point to Judaism in her life, really, and it's through, the word is halacha, the law. That's how her access has been. And actually through Will, a non-Jewish person who himself is sort of discovering Judaism because now he loves this woman who's an observant Jew, Will opens her eyes to a lot of different access points, and I hope that readers will walk away from that to justice as an access point, to maybe music as an access point, to community, to a broader community as an access point. And so I hope that readers will walk away with this idea that perhaps part of the lasting nature of Jewishness is that there are actually a pretty big diversity of access points and a pretty big diversity of experiences.
And relating to that question, how do you think this book will challenge or inspire others within the Jewish community?
Or anywhere, or outside of the Jewish community. So it's a little bit hard. Maybe later on the book tour I'll reach a point where it's easier to talk about inspiring people, but I'm very comfortable talking about challenging people. So I hope that everything I write challenges people, and particularly, I want to think about women's desire here, which is, if I have one theme that crosses almost all my writing, it's women's desire and women's sense of agency over their own desire. And I think we're in an interesting place in the world where art has sort of caught up to where I'd like to be. In books and in movies and in music, you can read about really powerful and free experiences of women's desire. And there's no doubt that there are many women in the world who are living that in an embodied way, but I don't feel like the world has caught up to the art yet. And so until the world catches up to the art, and until women's desire is really something that women have control over, then I would like to beat that drum a little bit in my writing. And so that is certainly one of the ways that I hope that readers will be challenged.
Well, that's awesome, and I definitely felt that while I was reading to it as well, from the female perspective. All right, we've actually done pretty good with the questions and our timing, so I have one last question. This is your debut novel, very exciting. What has been the most memorable experience for you during this process?
I mean, that's a hard question sitting in this room because I want to be like this. Or I'm a little bit nervous about what's to come in many cities when people that I definitely should know their names like come up to the table and I'm like, hey, you. But there are two that come to mind. One is a singular moment, and that's when we received the ARC, the Advanced Reader's Copy, or you might know it as a galley. And all of my kids were in town. I have 2 college-age kids and a 7-year-old, and we took the college-age kids, it was like a break, summer break maybe, out to dinner. And I wasn't driving, so I'd had a few drinks, and we didn't know the ARC was coming. And we walked in the door, and there was a package at our door. It had come kind of late, and my husband said, like, it's from Penguin Random House. And it was like the most pleasant and immediate sobering of my life. I snapped right to it, and it was like extremely exciting. I'm one of those kids who, in my first grade Ramona Quimby diary, wrote like, I'm going to be an author. So I feel like an immense amount of privilege that I've gotten here, and that I could hold that ARC in my hands. But the other thing, and I feel like it's important to give voice to this because everybody's process is really different, is Cambria, California, which is a tiny town on the Central Coast. Like, don't tell people about it because it'll ruin it. But it's a beautiful, beautiful little town. And when I was writing and editing this book, and it took me a very long time, I was raising young children. I was a single mother for a while before I met Patrick. And it took me a long time, and the one I'm writing now is going much more quickly. It's very incentivizing to sell a book. But this took me a decade to write and edit, a little bit more. And I didn't really have time in my life. I was working, I was putting food on the table, literally. And so my 2 older children, I split custody with my ex-husband. And so and then later Patrick and I would have every other weekend, we would have 3 days with no kids. And several times a year, we would go up to this little town of Cambria and rent a very cheap motel room right along the beach. And all I would do is take walks on the beach, which is where I do a lot of my writing and walking. I'm sure there are many other walkers in the room. And write or edit, all like in 8 or 9 hours at a time. And so that unfolded over many years, but that's also a really formative experience. And I liked Cambria before I made it my writing spot, but now it's like my favorite place on earth.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with me and with the whole room. And that concludes our prepared questions for the evening. And we're ready to move over to Q&A. So is there anybody, do you want the microphone? Okay, handing it over.
I know very few people in this room have read the book. A few people have read the book. But like, be brave and ask me anything. You don't have to have read it to ask me a question. You have one, Daddy? I see you giggling.
I have a few, but I'm going to ask them in another setting.
Anybody?
Oh, too close to me.
I'm curious about your process. Did you start with an idea of the end in mind that you wanted to get to, and then find your path toward it? Or did you start not knowing what the end might be?
That's a great question. Like a little of both. So what happened with this book is I moved into the Pico Robertson neighborhood of Los Angeles, and very, very soon after I moved in, like in my memory it's weeks, maybe it was months, but very soon after I moved in, a young unmarried friend of mine told me a story about a wife swap in the community. And I'm not modern Orthodox. I'm not really any denomination, right? Like I keep a kosher kitchen. It's complicated. I drive on Shabbos. This is not. But I lived in this neighborhood for a long time, and this man told me the story of a wife swap in the community, and he was young and unmarried, so it didn't happen to him. And I was like, go on. And I said, do you know anybody who might want to have coffee with me and talk about this? And he said, why? And I said, because I'm a writer. and I did ultimately have a few coffees and lunches with people, which is not at all to say, my position is not that this is endemic or widespread. I just wanted to talk to the people. Nobody told me a first person story, by the way. People would be like, oh, my cousin, and then they had all these amazing details. Right. So I'd be like, oh, really? I'd be like, so your cousin. So I had, but that's not a novel, right? But right away I was like, there's a nugget in there. And actually for a long time, before I started writing, I thought that there was it was gonna be a story about a love triangle, about this woman and this husband and like the man who she sleeps with at the wife swap and or at the key party. And it just it wasn't working. Like I made a few notes, I tried writing it, it wasn't that interesting to me. And so it took me a little while to come to Rena's story. And this idea, and at this moment when I started writing, this is when polyamory is one way to call it, but it was like the beginning of its ascendancy. And people in our culture have a different language now for it than we did 10 years ago. And there are stories in the New Yorker and the New York Times about it. And you might know somebody who's in an open marriage, which is different, by the way, than a key party. I'm very, very aware. But there was this shift happening. And I was really interested in what would happen to a character. I could imagine in a lot of marriages this working. There's no judgment call about what people do in their bedrooms, consenting adults, but I was really interested in thinking about a character for whom it didn't work. And once I had the idea of Rena, I had a pretty good idea of the end. You sometimes hear writers, and I'm sure this is true for them, saying and then my characters just took the story away from me, and I don't experience that. I'm like, I'm writing them. This is my story. Nobody ran away with it. But how the middle unfolded did change as I was writing it. But once I had the idea of Rena and what her story was, then I had an idea of the ending. But it took me a minute to get there.
Hello. Not having read it, but knowing that you are both personally and professionally Jewish, and knowing that the world is big but the community is small, did the subject matter feel risky?
So I'm not going to talk about the organization I work at. I've been very careful to separate it out. And a couple of colleagues asked me this week, are you going to post in one of the Slack channels? I work in an international Jewish organization now. And I said, well, maybe you could post it in the Slack channel. I don't really want to post it in the Slack channel. People know that it's coming. So I actually think that, yes, Lynn, it has been a bit of an issue, and it's hard in some spaces when people ask me about the book or the book launch or how it's going. I'll tell you one way my husband has characterized it. He said there are a lot of boners in this book. And one time I misquoted him, and I said that, oh, my husband said there are too many boners in this book, and he was like, I did not say too many. I just said a lot. And so when people who you work with in the Jewish community ask you what your book is about, I can give a synopsis on one foot, but then if they ask a follow-up question, I have to give them a warning. And they're like, oh, great, I'm going to pre-order it. I'm like, great. I hope you love it. People also ask me a related question sometimes about, do you think that your old neighbors will be angry with you? And I actually, what I would like to think is it's a little bit of a silly question, because who am I? I'm nobody. Why should they have meaningful and rich lives, and their practice is not directed by a story that one lady tells about one person in the community. So might there be some people whatever, maybe I'll sell more copies if they're mad about it. But I don't really think that I'm their concern when people ask me that question. And on the other hand, I've heard from some people who are either still in the community or a little bit removed from the community they grew up in. I've received many heartening letters now from people who, it's funny how people manage to get their hands on something early if they really want it. And who've said like, this story is so meaningful to me. And so I think there's like a flip side to every anxiety I might have about the community. There's a flip side to somebody for whom the story might be particularly impactful. So. My child gonna ask me a question.
Okay, that's fun. As someone who has not fully read the book, though I might as well have, considering how long you've been writing it, there was that scene where she gets sick.
Without any spoilers.
Without any spoilers.
Yeah.
It was very specific. Would you mind letting us know what your inspiration was for that?
Okay, so my character doesn't eat non-kosher food. And her whole life, so when I was in 4th grade, we had to write in a journal every day for my beloved teacher, Lisa McCorkle. And some of you might know her because she's still in the community here. And every day for 3/4 of the year, I wrote a very sad message about how I wanted a puppy and how horrible my parents were for not entertaining the request. And then there had to be like a little intervention with my teacher and me, and she said like you should try writing about something else. And this is how, so people say how much of you is in the story, and I say in most ways almost none at all, and then in other ways entirely it's my story, right? Because my character has a very similar experience, but with SpaghettiOs, which are not kosher. And she writes in her journal in grade school how much she watches Sunday morning cartoons and she just wants to know what a fucking SpaghettiO tastes like. And there's ultimately an intervention with her, and in my book, the parents as well get called in and they're like, there are so many beautiful kosher foods, and she's like, I know. And they buy her like a kosher stars and sauce, and it's terrible. Anyway, so as her life falls apart in her adult life, there is a scene, and I won't spoil it too much, where she finally goes off the derech, some might say off the path, and she eats a bunch of non-kosher food. And she doesn't go as hard as you think. She's like not eating bacon. She's just eating like packaged food that doesn't have a kosher hechsher, a marking on it. And so she discovers that SpaghettiOs are also horrible. They're just as bad as the stars. And although my character is an atheist, which we haven't really talked about, and that's part of her identity struggle, she does, in the moment when she first becomes very sick after this experience, think like, God? Yeah.
All right, I'll ask the last question. We'll get to signing. Since we are in a bookstore, and as a fellow alumnus of the Haunted Bookshop, I gotta know, what are you currently reading? What's the last great book you read? And what's one book you think everyone should read?
Oh my God, this is so hard because I'm really bad with names. Okay, right now I'm reading Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange, which is his second book, and it's fabulous. I'm also writing my book, so I'm actually reading pretty slowly now, because or else what happens is my next book, like 4 chapters will sound like Tommy Orange, and so you have to be a little bit careful with what you read as you write, and you also need to be a reader. So reading Tommy Orange. The last great book I read, oh my God, it was so good, Northwoods by Daniel Mason. And if you've seen it in a bookstore, maybe you would, it has a very recognizable cover because there's sort of a stylized mountain lion on the cover. And it's a remarkable story. And if I tell you what it's about, you're gonna be like, that sounds boring. It's about a property in Western Massachusetts. And it goes from before the Civil War up until modern times, tracing this property. And it's like one of the best books I've ever read. It was shortlisted for a bunch of prizes. He's remarkable. He's also like a practicing psychiatrist and a professor at Stanford. And when you read his bio, you're like, oh my God, like what am I even doing? Anyway, it's a great book. And then a book that I'm an evangelist for, I can never get the title right. So can anybody, is it Sabrina and Karina or Karina and Sabrina? Has anybody read Callie? Sabrina and Karina by Callie Onstein Fajardo. I'm not sure if I got her name right. It's an amazing book. It's a book of short stories. So I am a daughter of the American West, and I love reading and thinking about the American West, and so is Callie. And this book is interconnected short stories from an indigenous, own voices, feminist perspective. And they're beautiful, and they're funny, and I think everybody in the world should read this book. And she put out a novel since, but one of my tiny hopes in being a poet, I'm like, maybe someday I'll just like email that lady and tell her how amazing her book is, and then she'll like want to email me back.
I bet she will too. That's how I've gotten some guests on my podcast. I just cold email, and so many people are open to talking, especially in the book world. Authors are amazing. All right, so this concludes our question section. Thank you guys so much for coming out. Congratulations again, Jessica.
Thank you. I really want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to Stacks for hosting me. When my publicist said, where do you want to go in your hometown? I said, there's this amazing, vibey bookstore. And then I had to explain to all of my Tucson people why they were going to drive to not just Ora Valley, but like what I experience as deepest Ora Valley. Thank you, Vicki, for you and your really thoughtful questions. But also, thanks to everybody in this room. I mean, one of my 3 children, my husband and my parents and my brother and my aunts and uncles, so many people are here. But I have to thank everybody in this room. I thought I was going to walk in and know everybody, which would have been one experience. And I know a lot of people from a lot of different walks of my life. But also thank you to all of the people who are sitting here who I actually don't know at all. I'm so grateful that you mixed it up. But I should say that there are some people here in my life who I've known who are not related to me, but who I've known since I was born, and neighbors of my parents who've lived in their neighborhood forever. And so I'm just, my youngest son's doctor, like one of my high school buddies, like just thank you all for being here.
All right, let's get ready for book signing, everybody.